A barefoot boy stops a millionaire in the rain and says, "I can make your mother walk again." He knows her stroke date, her symptoms, even the secrets she cries about when no one's around. No scam, no ask, just 5 minutes, and a truth Charles Radnor isn't ready to face. This isn't about medicine, it's about memory. And what happens next isn't a miracle, it's a reckoning. Because sometimes the person who unlocks your healing isn't a doctor in a white coat. It's a stranger who's been waiting for you to remember what love forgot. If you've ever felt like life hands you answers in the most unexpected forms, pause right now. Like this video, share it, and tell someone. You never know where healing begins. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow we have another incredible story and there are many surprises waiting for you in the next parts. The boy's name is Tyrese, and the silence in the car is heavier than traffic. Charles doesn't speak, neither does the boy. They pass moss-covered trees and gated mansions like they're rolling through two different versions of the same city, one lined with prestige, the other with ghosts. Charles watches the kid in the rearview mirror, waiting for a tell. Some twitch, some angle, but Tyrese sits like a monk, calm, composed, utterly unbothered by the $1,000 suit in the front seat. That bothers Charles more than he wants to admit. People usually try to impress him. This boy? He doesn't even try to exist loudly, and somehow that says more than words ever could. When they pull through the gates of the Radnor estate, Charles feels the weight of his decision press against his spine. "You've got 5 minutes," he mutters. "You go near my mother and I don't like what I see. I'll have you out of there so fast you'll forget how you got in." Tyrese only nods. There's no fear in him, and that unnerves Charles more than begging would have. They walk through the side entrance, not the main one, not the showy path. And as they move down the polished hallway, Charles catches something strange. Tyrese doesn't look around like a guest. He walks like he's been here before. Like the walls remember him. Like maybe the house itself is holding its breath. Helen Radnor is in the sunroom, her wheelchair set just beside the window. She turns when they enter, expecting Charles, but not the boy. "Who's this?" she asks, voice thin but alert. Tyrese steps forward, hands loose at his sides. "Hi, Miss Helen," he says. She narrows her eyes. "Do I know you?" "Not yet," he replies. Then he reaches into his pocket and places a folded sketch on the table beside her. "You drew this in 1982. It's the oak tree behind your house on Ogeechee Road." Helen's breath catches. Her fingers tremble as she unfolds the paper. "I haven't seen this in 40 years, she whispers. Behind her, Charles stiffens. "How the hell do you have that?" But Tyrese doesn't answer him. He's watching Helen, like she's the only person in the room who matters. "I found it in the attic," he says gently, "with the others. You stopped drawing after the stroke, but you never stopped being an artist. I thought maybe this would remind you what your hands used to know." Helen's eyes glisten as she traces the faded lines. Charles steps forward, voice sharp. "Who are you?" Tyrese turns to face him, calm as ever. "I had a dream about her 3 nights ago. She was sitting alone, couldn't move, whispering your name." Charles scoffs. "Dreams? That's what this is?" "Maybe," Tyrese says, "but here I am, and in that moment everything shifts. Not with thunder, not with fire, just with the slow, certain realization that something sacred has entered the room. Something Charles doesn't believe in, something Helen hasn't felt in years, and neither of them, though they don't know it yet, will leave that room the same. If this moment cracked something open in you, pass it on, subscribe, share the story, because sometimes healing begins when someone finally sees what you stopped believing in. The side entrance wasn't meant for guests, but Charles didn't feel like this barefoot boy was a guest anyway. He didn't belong, and yet somehow, as Tyrese stepped across the threshold, it felt like the house shifted, like it recognized him. The hallway was lined with curated silence. Expensive rugs, old portraits, light that never quite touched the corners. And still, Tyrese walked like he'd been there before. He didn't ask where the sunroom was. He didn't hesitate. Charles noticed. He moved through the house like it remembered him, Charles thought, not like a stranger, like someone the walls had been waiting for. Helen's name slipped from Tyrese's lips before they reached her door, not loud, not hesitant, just spoken with the weight of knowing, and that alone knocked something loose in Charles's chest. Helen Radnor turned her head slowly when they entered. Her hair, silver and soft, framed a face that still held fire in the eyes, even as time had stolen strength from everything else. She smiled out of habit when she saw her son, but the smile faded when she caught sight of Tyrese. Her eyes squinted like she was trying to remember a dream. Tyrese didn't speak. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small, folded piece of paper, yellowed at the corners. He placed it gently on the table next to her. "You drew this," he said. Helen's hands trembled. She picked it up slowly, unfolded it. It was a sketch of the oak tree that used to grow behind their house on Ogeechee Road. "I haven't seen this in 40 years, she whispered. Charles stiffened, his voice sharp. "Where did you get that?" But Tyrese wasn't watching him. He only watched Helen, whose eyes were beginning to glass over. "It was in the attic," Tyrese said, "with the others. You stopped drawing after the stroke, but you didn't forget how." Helen traced the edges of the page with her fingers. "I stopped because it didn't matter anymore," she said quietly, "because no one remembered." Charles moved toward her. "Mom, don't!" But she waved him off. Her eyes never left the paper. Tyrese knelt beside her. "I had a dream about you 3 nights ago. You were sitting right there, couldn't move, whispering his name." He tilted his chin toward Charles. "You were waiting for him to come home." Charles's voice sliced through the air. "Enough." "You asked him to visit. Said it might be your last birthday," Tyrese continued gently. "He didn't come." "I said stop," Charles growled. Helen went still, her face unreadable, but her hand tightened slightly on the edge of the sketch. Tyrese's voice didn't rise. It didn't tremble. "You waited." But the stroke came first. His words didn't open wounds. They traced ones already bleeding. Helen's left hand twitched. Barely, but enough. A flicker, a forgotten signal. She didn't speak. She only stared at it, as if unsure if she imagined it. Tyrese said nothing. He didn't call it out, didn't demand applause. He just sat there, patient, watching. The room had gone heavy, like even the air knew something was happening. Charles didn't move. He didn't speak. And Helen's hand moved again, subtler this time, like muscle memory searching for permission. Her hand moved like a forgotten tune finding its melody. No one said a word. Even the housekeeper, Dolores, who had hovered at the edge of the doorway, remained silent. But her hand drifted slowly to her mouth. Helen whispered, "I felt that." Tyrese smiled. Not like a kid who proved something, but like someone who already knew. Charles stood in the hallway just outside the sunroom. He leaned against the wall, one hand clenched at his side, the other rubbing the back of his neck. His world wasn't supposed to work this way. Science had rules. Grief had a routine. Doctors had timelines. But this? This was something else. He heard his mother's voice in there, calmer than it had been in years. Not loud, not sudden, just present. And he didn't know whether to walk away or walk in. So he stood in that hallway, suspended, somewhere between guilt and awe, somewhere between a son and a stranger. If this moment stirred something in you, something you haven't felt in a while, drop a comment and tell us what it unlocked. Tap like if you believe memory can be medicine. And if someone you love has ever needed 5 quiet minutes to feel seen, share this story. Let it find them. Charles didn't sleep. He sat in his study, lights off, just the amber glow of bourbon catching reflections in the glass. The boy's words wouldn't leave his head. Neither would his mother's hand. The way it moved, like it had remembered a song no one had played in years. The photo on the bookshelf stared back at him. Him and Helen, long before the stroke, her arms wrapped around his waist like she had no intention of letting go. He had spent the last 11 years buying the best care, modifying the house, arranging therapy. But guilt doesn't care about receipts. It doesn't shout, it whispers just loud enough to keep you up, and now that whisper had a name. Tyrese. A barefoot kid with no records, no history, and somehow, all the answers. At dawn, Charles stepped out onto the back porch. Tyrese was already there, cross-legged on the steps, talking to one of the house cats like it was an old friend. Charles walked over, slow. "You slept here?" Tyrese nodded. "Didn't want to leave yet." They sat in silence for a beat. Then Charles asked what had been sitting on his tongue since the first moment. "Where are you from?" Tyrese didn't blink. "I just show up," Charles chuckled, humorless. "That's not an answer." "Maybe it's the only one that matters," Tyrese said. He spoke like someone twice his age, like his voice carried maps of people's souls, and pain was just part of the landscape. "You talk like you've seen too much," Charles muttered. "I listen," Tyrese replied. "Most people don't." And in that quiet exchange something cracked, not loudly, but deep. Like foundation shifting beneath a house that had forgotten it wasn't built on stone. He talked like he carried a compass that didn't point north, but pointed true. Inside, Helen was already awake. Dolores stood nearby, unsure whether to stop what was happening or witness it. "I want to try," Helen said, "just for a moment." Her voice was steady, not strong but certain. With the nurse on one side and Dolores on the other, Helen gripped the handles of her chair and pushed. First, her right foot slid forward, then her knee locked, just barely. Then her left leg, the one they said was done, trembled. For 3 seconds she stood. Not tall, not fully, but she stood, and then she sat back down, breathless, not defeated, laughing like a woman who'd just remembered she wasn't done. Because that's what healing really is. It's not instant. It's not clean. It's memory returning to the body, asking if it wants to live again. Charles saw it. He was there, in the doorway, frozen, the same man who had hired 7 different specialists, who'd flown his mother across states, who'd accepted, years ago, that hope was a cruel word. And now he watched his mother stand because a kid with no shoes reminded her who she used to be. That night he called his private investigator. "Find me everything on a boy named Tyrese Mallory, 11 or 12, no address, no records, no known school." Franklin, on the other end, said, "You're calling me for ghost stories now?" But Charles wasn't joking. He needed control back. He needed to explain the unexplainable. Because science said no, but Helen, she just said yes. Later that evening, Helen sat in her chair by the window, sketchbook in her lap, pencil moving gently across the page. Her hands shook, but they moved. "I feel awake," she whispered, more to herself than anyone, and Charles, watching from the hallway, didn't know whether that scared him more or gave him peace. If you've ever been afraid to hope again, let this remind you. What's buried isn't broken. Like, subscribe, and share this moment, because sometimes healing isn't about finding new answers. It's about remembering old truths. Helen didn't look up when Charles entered the sunroom. She was sketching again, shaky but determined. Her left hand still faltered, but her right had found rhythm again. She didn't need to see him to know the question hanging in his chest. "You remind me of your father," she said softly. Charles blinked. "That's not something you say often." She paused, pencil frozen mid-stroke. "There's a reason for that." The room went still. "He didn't die in a car crash, Charles. I told you that because it was easier." Charles felt the air leave his lungs. "Then what happened?" "He vanished," she said. "One day he just didn't come home. No note, no call, no body, just silence." He swallowed hard. "You never tried to find out?" "I tried," she said, "but back then, they didn't look too hard for black men who disappeared. Some men leave, others fade. Both break something behind." She reached into her cardigan pocket and unfolded a worn photo. She handed it to him. It showed a man, tall, confident, standing in front of a diner, holding the hand of a young boy. The boy's posture, his eyes, his stillness, they mirrored Tyrese in ways Charles couldn't explain. "That's Dad?" Charles asked. Helen nodded. "I found this years ago. The boy in the picture, I never knew his name." Charles stared at it, stunned. "He looks like Tyrese." "I thought the same," she whispered. "But how could he be?" Rhetoric rose in Charles's throat, unbidden. What if memory isn't linear? What if healing runs backward too? The logic didn't hold. But the feeling? The feeling carved a new room inside his chest, one he didn't know he had. That night, Tyrese was gone. Charles checked the back porch, the kitchen, even the garden. Nothing. No footprints, no bag, no sign he'd ever been there. Dolores hadn't seen him leave. The cameras, no footage. Like the house itself had swallowed him. Charles called Franklin again. "I need answers." But Franklin's voice was unusually quiet on the other end. "There's no school record, no birth certificate, no missing persons report that matches. Closest I found was a child in Jacksonville who vanished 6 years ago, but he'd be 17 now." Charles didn't reply. He didn't need to. The absence said more than words could. Tyrese hadn't just walked away. He had evaporated. Or maybe he had never arrived, the way Charles thought he had. The next morning, Charles walked out to the gate. Something fluttered in the breeze. Tucked between the bars was a folded sheet of paper, a sketch, pencil, careful lines. It was their house, drawn from the angle of the street, and in the corner, small but unmistakable, a boy stood barefoot, hands in his pockets, head tilted up toward the sky. Tyrese. There was no name, no note, just that image. He didn't knock, Charles thought. Etched himself into the wood of our lives. He stared at the sketch for a long time, unsure whether to feel comforted or haunted. Maybe both. The boy hadn't come to be known, he came to be remembered. That night, Charles sat beside his mother again. She was stronger now, still fragile, but present. "You think we'll ever see him again?" he asked. Helen looked toward the window where the wind stirred the curtains. "I think we already did," she said. Her voice was firm, eyes steady. "I think he came to return something we lost, and now that it's back, he doesn't need to stay." Charles didn't speak. He just nodded, realizing the door that had opened inside him wouldn't close the same way again. If you've ever lost someone before, you could ask the question that mattered. Let this be your reminder. Not all disappearances are abandonments. Some are returns in disguise. Share this story. Let someone else feel seen. The garden had become Helen's proving ground. Not to anyone else, but to herself. That morning, Charles wheeled her out under the soft light breaking through the camellia branches. No nurses, no ceremony, just the two of them. The iron bench still stood where she used to sit and read before the stroke. Now she stood before it. Charles offered a hand, but she shook her head gently. She needed to try alone. Her right foot moved first, then her left. The tremble in her knee made Charles hold his breath, but she didn't stop. 1 foot, then another. 4 steps, then 6. Her hand grazed the top of the bench for balance, but she didn't collapse. Each step was a letter in a sentence she thought she'd never finish. When she finally sat, it wasn't out of defeat, it was punctuation. She smiled, breath heavy but full, and whispered, "Still me." Something had shifted inside the house, too. It no longer felt like a mausoleum for past decisions. Charles noticed music playing in the afternoons, old jazz records Helen once loved. Dolores opened the windows now. Sketch pads reappeared in the living room. Warmth returned in quiet ways. Charles stopped checking the locks so much. One night, as he passed Helen's door, he heard her humming. He leaned against the hallway wall and let the sound wash over him. Healing doesn't shout, he thought. It rearranges the furniture. He didn't know if it was magic or memory. But the silence in the house no longer felt like grief. It felt like space being made for something else. At the office, Charles surprised his board of directors. He canceled a product pitch and redirected part of the annual budget. "We're funding a new initiative," he said, "physical therapy and mental health access for underserved youth. No media, no press, just action." He called it the Tyrese Initiative. Some executives asked who Tyrese was. Charles just said, "Someone who reminded me what legacy actually means." The first program launched from an old community center on Habersham. Charles visited every week, not to cut ribbons or take photos, just to watch, to sit quietly and listen as kids practiced balance drills or spoke to counselors. He didn't say much. He just stayed long enough to feel what progress looked like when no one demanded a result. One evening, Charles sat alone in the sunroom, sketchbook on his lap. He hadn't drawn since college. Tonight, he tried. A tree, a porch, a boy in the corner. The lines weren't sharp, but they were honest. He stopped halfway through and stared at the pencil in his hand. He used to wear control like a suit. Now he wears questions. Questions about his father, about Tyrese, about what it means to show up when no one asks. He looked out toward the garden. Helen had taken 12 steps that day, and though he had walked through skyscrapers and boardrooms, he'd never felt smaller or prouder. The next morning, a folded sketch was stuck in the gate again. No note, no name, just a drawing of the back garden. Helen sitting on the bench, Charles beside her, both of them smiling, and in the corner, barely visible, the outline of a boy, barefoot, watching, waiting, present. Charles didn't say anything. He simply closed his eyes and let it settle in his chest like a quiet echo that refused to fade. If you've ever believed that healing has to be loud, let this remind you, sometimes the softest steps echo the longest. Share this story. Let someone else take their first step today. Charles sat beside Helen on the patio as dusk softened the edges of the day. The garden was quiet. No nurses, no devices, just the warm hum of life finding its way back into the spaces grief once hollowed. Helen leaned back in her chair, her legs wrapped in a light blanket, her eyes on the camellia tree. "I used to be afraid of dying," she said without turning. "Afraid I'd leave before I was remembered right. But I'm not anymore." Charles didn't respond immediately. Her words weren't about fear. They were about arrival. "I don't mean I'm ready to go," she added with a faint laugh. "I mean I'm finally alive again." Her voice didn't tremble. It settled. Peace had stopped being about survival. It had become a return, a soft reclaiming of everything time tried to erase. Later, Helen rested her hand on a photo Charles had left on the table. The old black and white one with his father and a child who looked so much like Tyrese. Her thumb brushed the corner. "He reminds me of your father," she said quietly. "Not in his face, in his stillness, in the way he listened." Charles didn't interrupt. "You think he could be connected?" he finally asked. She didn't answer directly. Maybe healing isn't linear. Maybe grace doesn't follow clocks. Maybe it loops backward too. Time in that moment stopped being a straight road and became a circle, a ripple, a whisper that stretched between generations and said, "You're not done." It wasn't about logic. It was about resonance. And Charles no longer needed to understand everything to believe in what it meant. In the weeks that followed, life reshaped itself. Helen walked every morning, 10 steps, then 12, then more. She asked for music again. Jazz, Motown, anything with soul. Charles stayed home more often, sat in rooms just to be near them when they filled with laughter again. The staff noticed the difference, not in orders or schedules, but in light, in the way the house seemed to breathe again. And at the center of it all was something unexplainable. Not magic, not miracle, just a reminder that sometimes dignity isn't restored, it's remembered. Because when people stop asking what's wrong with someone and start asking what happened to them, healing begins. And when we start showing up without needing a reason, legacy blooms. One evening, Charles walked through the garden alone. He paused at the iron gate and saw another sketch folded into the bars. A new one. It showed the sunroom window, soft light glowing inside, and two figures. Helen, upright in her chair, and Charles beside her, head tilted in conversation. No boy this time, just them. It wasn't goodbye. It was release. Charles didn't open the gate. He didn't chase the artist. He just held the sketch to his chest and let the silence say what words never could. He didn't need answers anymore. He had peace. And peace, he realized, wasn't something you find, it's something you feel when you finally stop asking for proof. If you've ever held grief so long it started to feel like your personality, let this story remind you. Kindness doesn't raise its voice. It doesn't storm in. It sits beside you, barefoot, and reminds your body it still has a soul. It helps you remember what it felt like to laugh without guilt, to hope without hesitation, to forgive without conditions. And if this story touched something you've buried, share it. Not for the views, not for the comments. For someone else who forgot they were still allowed to heal. Tell them. Show them. Because nobody's forgotten, not really. They're just waiting to be seen again. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow we have another incredible story, and there are many surprises waiting for you in the next parts.